Back in the innocent days of 2014, when things basically seemed like they were going alright, I put together a video summary of 12 different versions of one of my favourite games. And it got my usual couple of hundred views and then sat there. Then, in April 5 years later, the unknowable computer god in the bowels of Google said, "Today I'm going to get people to watch a lot about Prince of Persia," and pointed 165,000 people at my video. It looks like I'm now on my way to being a moderately popular games YouTube channel, so you can look forward to me probably saying something inexcusably racist over the next few days. Still, since the big push, I've been inundated with comments from people who wanted me to talk about their preferred version, hopefully a little more slowly than before. So I've scoured the internet for even more versions of the game and the ways to run them, to bring you a tour of 9 more versions on top of the original video. Okay, here's the Amiga version, now please stop emailing me. I did mention this one in passing in the original video, but chose not to cover it fully because I considered it too close to the DOS version to be worth talking about, and at first glance I think you'll be able to see why. The graphics and presentation of the game, as well as the movement and physics, are very much identical to the port that I knew on the PC, and it has the exact same progression of approximately 12.75 levels. Nevertheless, I think this is a good time to reiterate one of the main things that I'm looking for in the conversions. Last time around I said that ports of Prince of Persia lived or died by their controls, describing the DOS version as the gold standard for how responsive the inputs were. Several people responded, with varying degrees of literacy, saying that I was stupid and wrong, and on reflection perhaps responsive isn't quite the word I'm looking for. The Prince is among the heaviest feeling characters in a game because of the human way in which he moves. He takes a realistic amount of time to get into a run and stop from one, and to make a running jump you have to hold up as you approach an edge, well before you would normally hit a jump key on a standard platformer. But the point I was trying to make is that the controls are very precise. Once you get to know them, you know exactly when to jump, when to block and strike during sword fights, and you never feel that anything is inconsistent or you die through no fault of your own. And I'm happy to say that the Amiga version's controls work perfectly. The game is credited to programmer Dan Gorlin instead of the PC's Lance Grudy, but the exact same care has been applied to the precision of the movement. The difference, as you'll notice from the video footage, is that the game is tuned to run more slowly than the PC version. Prince of Persia DOS normally runs on a 12 frame per second cycle, meaning that any slight difference is very noticeable, and you have to adjust your timing slightly to accommodate the difference in the frame rate. This isn't an emulator mistake, because I remembered the exact same thing from seeing the game on an Amiga belonging to a friend from school, and it's thanks to his big brother who told me how to get past the shadow that I was ever able to complete the game at all. I wondered if the speed difference might plausibly have been due to the game being written on an NTSC machine or something, and intended to run at 60 frames per second, so out of curiosity I told the emulator to boost the frame rate a bit. This got it closer to the PC version, but had the side effect of altering the sound where it was obviously out of pitch, so I don't think this was the intended speed. There are a couple of curious tiny differences beyond the speed though. On the PC, the Prince's doppelganger, the Shadow, is drawn as an uncomfortable shimmery outline, but this edition chooses to display him in a ghostly white instead. It could be for palette reasons, or they might just have preferred it. Additionally, the Prince at the very end of the game appears in a slightly off-white outfit, and the colour of his hair changes when he turns. This looks like a small sprite mistake, or something to do with how many colours the Amiga screen mode they're using could display at one time. But what I found really interesting was that the collision bug on level 7, where you could sail through the wall on the left here for the sake of speedrunning, has been fixed. At first I was paranoid that I'd just forgotten how to do it, but I tried several times and the Prince landed steadfastly on the floor each time. After seeing that, I wondered about some of the other exploits in the game. I found that the later bug with the chopper that doesn't activate if you drop down from above is still intact, and I was surprised that it was still also possible for you to change the screen the wrong way towards the top of level 12 and take a shortcut to the top. So the game's underlying code must have come from the same route as the PC version did, but something very subtle must have changed in the movement. The Amiga version came out in October 1990, which puts it a month after the DOS edition, so it's possible that it was more or less taken straight from that codebase with a bit of extra time to clean up a couple of known problems. Or it could have been some completely different change that just happened to fix the behaviour when colliding at that exact angle with a wall. One last thing that I want to mention about the Amiga port is that most of the disk images you'll find for it will come with a bolted-on introduction and trainer that loads before the game. In the 90s, when games came on floppy disks, they often included mechanisms to prevent unscrupulous people copying the disk and giving it to all their smelly friends, which is incidentally how I acquired Prince of Persia back in the day as well. As I briefly mentioned in the last video, Prince did this by including a mini-level where you were given a word to look up in the accompanying manual, and you then had to drink the potion matching the first letter of that word. Faced with this, groups of technical dabblers called crackers would come together with the goal of removing that copy protection so games could be pirated freely, and they would often add their own little signatures to the game with very technically impressive introductions to show off their coding skills. One of the common Amiga images floating around the internet was doctored by a group called Angels, who altered the in-game copy protection to just tell you the right letter of the potion to drink. Their copy also added a trainer, which is a program that loads before the main game and can alter specific parts of memory to change the game's behaviour. In this case, you're given the option to have infinite time or lives. The trainer can accomplish this by making sure the value in memory that represents the time remaining always stays at a certain value, or replacing the code that deducts a life so that it instead does nothing. So that's the Amiga version. It's slower, but otherwise very accurate to the PC version, and if you're looking to play it online, it might be difficult to find a version that hasn't been manipulated in some small way. As we've seen before though, in the early 90s, porting to just the PC and Amiga was never going to be enough. Given the odd name of the Sam Coupe, I had assumed this port was for one of the various Japanese computers, but I was surprised to discover that it's a British machine that I'd never heard of. It was one of the roughly 5 zillion different home micros released in the UK in the late 80s. This one was made by a company based in Wales called Miles Gordon Technology, who were originally a manufacturer of add-ons for the ZX Spectrum. They chose to venture into creating their own Spectrum-compatible home computer in 1989, named the Coupe after its extremely tenuous resemblance to some sort of vehicle if you look at it from the right angle while slightly drunk. Unfortunately, this came right at the end of the lifespan of this era of home computers, and their poor timing led to the computer and their company quickly fizzling out. However, it did survive just long enough to get its own version of Prince of Persia, thus granting it legitimacy as a system. Unlike the Amiga, this version of the game was entirely decoupled from any other port and was written with no access to the source code or graphics files. As a result, it has a couple of interesting features that make it stand out. The most obvious is in the level layouts, which can deal in half tiles as well as full ones. This is something completely unique to this version. Not even the otherwise complete overhaul in the Super Nintendo version did this. The level layouts are a little different to utilise this feature. I can't remember any points where it affects the progression of a level in a major way, but it lets the game fine-tune the width of gaps a bit more, and sometimes means you have to climb up and walk over a bit to reach a floor plate that's been shifted over instead of just hitting it with your fingertips from below. Outside that, level 11 has had the most changes made to it, with a more challenging set of falling tiles to get to the big potion, and an altered midsection to avoid having to make a very long jump off the edge of a screen. The movement of the Prince in this version might best be described as wobbly. The basics of it honestly work pretty well, with the feel of starting, stopping and turning perfectly similar to the PC version. Uniquely to this port, as the Prince runs, you get a series of noise channel footsteps over the speakers which alternate between panning hard left and right, which gives an interesting aural effect even though it sounds like he's wearing his steel boots from Hot Topic. However, there are some oversights that prevent the game feeling 100% satisfying. One of the major things is similar to some of the other 8-bit conversions. The momentum of your jump stops after a certain distance and has you just fall straight down. This isn't important for completing any of the levels, but it can catch you off guard if you're used to taking some shortcuts that involve longer jumps. The other major issue is that you can't rely on careful steps to take you right up to the edge of platforms. The Prince will happily just step off without warning, greatly reducing the usefulness of this move. During my playthrough, I found myself mostly replacing it with the previously underused crouch key, which can inch you forward in finer increments so that you're lined up for a jump. Combat is also mostly functional, although it does lack some of the nuance that the DOS version had. None of the guards' different personalities have carried over, such as the defensive guard at the start of level 8. They only have one AI setting between them, and that setting is thick as mince. All fights can reliably be won by just hitting the strike button and occasionally advancing forwards, which is honestly quite nice because the block button makes the Prince shoot backwards and makes it difficult to keep your footing. Surprisingly, even changing sides with the guards works fairly well. I started off with quite a favourable impression of this port, but unfortunately that goodwill diminished gradually the more I played it. The quirks in the movement, which would be minor on their own, combine to form a game that feels more and more unforgiving the further you get in it. Platform edge detection is non-existent, so you have to line yourself up very manually for running jumps, and because the coupe controls lack diagonal keys, you can find yourself accidentally stepping off a ledge instead of jumping off it fairly often unless you precisely synchronise your button presses. The DOS version allows you to hit up and then quickly add a direction to do this, but the coupe doesn't. I instead found that the way to reliably do a standing jump was to face away from the edge and then make a little pirouette before starting the jump, letting you buffer the left or right press before adding the up key. All of these annoyances really come to a head on level 8, which continues to be the bane of my existence as a Prince of Persia player. This level makes you go through a very precise set of jumps in rapid succession, and the coupe version really gives you no room for error. One slip and you have to slog through the entire thing again, always having to be conscious of the very finicky rules for when you can move through spikes without being killed. You have to go extremely carefully with a constant fear of forgetting some oddity in the movement, which really robs the game of its pace, and as the emulator I was using didn't support save states, it made me realise that I may actually have understated the frustration of many of the other port's control oddities when I could just instantly restore myself to life and try again. I am making a conscious effort these days not to be as much of a grumpy old git as I used to be, so I don't want to be too harsh to this port. It is true that the conversion feels more like someone who's never seen the code trying his best to copy the game and its mechanics, but to be fair, that's appropriate because that's exactly how it was made. The game was almost entirely written by Chris White, a prolific Sam Coupe developer who also did things like its port of Lemmings. He wrote the port with no consultation from Broderbund or Jordan Mechner, writing his own interpretation of the game from the ground up. The graphics were imported by the very manual process of pausing the Amiga version frame by frame and copying the details of the sprites down onto graph paper, then reassembling them onto the target machine. You've really got to respect the effort he put in, not knowing whether or not this game would eventually be allowed to be published. So even though this port has a lot of inconsistency to it and came too late to make an impression, it's fairly impressive that it exists at all and is honestly still one of the better official 8-bit versions. It also has to be said that despite its flaws, it still works a lot better than the barely functional ports that Nintendo and Sega were willing to fob their players off with. Over in Japan, the NEC PC-98 was the dominant line of home computers until the IBM PC eventually won out against everything else. In 1990, it got the first ever port of Prince of Persia from the original Apple II, beating out the DOS version by a couple of months and really kicking the game into international recognition after its initial relative failure in America. It was handled by the unfortunately named Arsys Software and published by River Hill Soft, and it was the first in a string of ports that they did for Japanese computers that I have handled in completely the wrong order. In the previous video I talked about the TurboGrafx 16 edition and then the Sega CD one, which obviously had a lot of similar features between them, but both of those have their roots in this PC-9801 version. As a first showing of the game outside its Apple II roots, this was an incredible way to start off and puts many of the later ports to shame. The game has been given a huge graphical overhaul and upscaled to 640 by 400, which was just about as high a resolution as you could reasonably get at the time. It has a very busy appearance that can look like a bit of an assault on your retinas at first, but if you imagine viewing it through an old CRT monitor, you can imagine how the dithered colours would blend more together. And even with the bare pixels exposed, the dithering is so meticulously done that you really can't believe the screen is only showing 16 colours. I now realise that the graphics must have been drawn like this first, and then revised and downscaled for the TurboGrafx, which was the home console equivalent of the PC-98 series based on roughly the same technology. This would explain the occasional slightly tuggy movement I described on the previous video as the prince moves around, if there were perhaps a couple of rounding errors in his sprite's positioning. The controls are pretty much perfect, but there are a couple of very minor differences that are either unique to here or that I didn't notice before. This jump on level 11 is always awkward because it's the only place where the prince looks like he's landed on a platform but then slips. Here it also takes away a health point, but the game then forgave me obviously falling into spikes shortly afterwards when I was running a bit too enthusiastically, so I'll call it even. It's also the first port on which I've tested this to have fixed the wrong screen flip at the top of level 12, preventing you from using the shortcut to the sword, so you can tell that this has all been put together with great care for what they were doing. This was also the first port to introduce the final boss, where Jafar fights you on the bridge at the top of the tower, delegating the previous Jafar fight to one of his interns. Several extra options are made available in addition to the base game, none of which I can read, but I can tell that the game shares the speed options from the other Japanese ports, and the record keeping of your best times and replays for each level to further encourage time attack style gameplay. Like I found in a couple of Japanese versions in the last video, the combat is set uncomfortably slowly at first, and I felt I needed to kick it up a few notches to make it feel like it was going at the right pace. Otherwise, I absolutely cannot fault this port at all. It's easy to see how this really kicked Prince of Persia into high gear after the relatively primitive appearance of the Apple II version. And over the next couple of years, Riverhill would re-implement this version onto many other Japanese machines. Okay, let's say this first. Prince of Persia on the original Sharp X68000 is atrociously slow. And this isn't an emulator issue. The speed monitor says that it's running at 100%, the sound is fine, and the menus are all responsive. It's only when you get into the game that it seems like the castle is entirely submerged in treacle. But I'll get back to this and how to fix it. The X68000, or X68K, is another line of computers that was popular in Japan in the late 80s and early 90s. They happened to share a lot of architecture with most coin-operated arcade machines of the time, and were used by Capcom and other companies for game development. For this reason, the computer was known for its large and varied library of arcade ports. In 1991, Riverhill Soft added their version of Prince of Persia to its substantial lineup. The X68000 series was released in a very strict cycle with upgrades coming out every year. The series started with the plain X68K in 1987, followed by the X68K Ace 12 months later, then the X68K Expert, the X68K Pro, the X68K Super, and presumably the X68K b****me. When Prince of Persia came out, the Super would have been the latest release, although people would have owned various of the previous models. The 10 MHz clock speed of the base X68K is what the emulator XM6 defaults to, and it just doesn't have enough power behind it to run it acceptably. It technically works, but it's the equivalent of trying to play Rise of the Triad on a 286. This is a bit of a surprise given that the PC98 version, released a year previously, worked fine at exactly the same clock speed, but it goes to show that you can't just compare systems by the number of hertz you can stuff into them, no matter how much 90s computer manufacturers wanted us to. Bumping the clock speed up to match the Super at 16 MHz is just about enough to get the game going at a decent pace, though I preferred the Expert with 17.4, meaning that it would take a couple of years since Prince's release date for the computer lineup to really catch up with the game's demands. Speaking of speed, the options menu, common to the Japanese ports, makes an appearance here, but oddly it doesn't contain any of the speed controls. You're limited to the time and replay options and a couple of things for turning the sound on and off. And this is one of the ports that doesn't run at a consistent pace at all. The gameplay is very speedy up and slowy down, with the speed of the prince on any given screen very dependent on how many other objects happen to be there, and there's a disconcertingly long pause whenever the music has to change over, which will throw you off your rhythm. Level 11 is particularly bad for speed with the large number of falling tiles, and is noticeably more sluggish than any of the other levels. Combat, here and everywhere else, unfortunately remains slow and ponderous no matter how many cycles your CPU has, and until you remember that the game will happily ignore your attempts to block if you try to strike too soon afterwards, you'll suffer a lot of frustrating deaths. There's something else odd about the controls that I wasn't sure was a quirk of the emulator or how the Sharp keyboard works. The Shift key, which is normally the action button on the computer versions, here works for clinging onto platforms and striking with the sword, but won't allow you to take careful steps consistently. At first, I got into the strange habit of holding down both shift keys at the same time just to make absolutely sure the game got what I intended, but I then found out that the spacebar worked just as well for every action without me having to play a miniature game of Twister with my fingers. So I'm not sure if double shift is equivalent to space or if it was some other thing. Finally, there are a couple of other interesting differences that must have been deliberate choices, as they didn't carry over from the PC98 port. The bridge after you fight the Shadow towards the end of the game is totally invisible and doesn't appear beneath the prince's feet as he walks. And instead of considering level 12 a 3-part single level, this game divides it into 4 distinct ones. The fight with the Undersecretary is considered level 13, level 14 is the brief palace environment on the top floor, level 15 is the climactic fight with Jafar, and then in an unexpected move you're demoted to level 14 again for the final run to the princess. Earlier on in the game, I also want to mention the potion in level 4, which has had its position altered slightly to create the most evil moment that I've ever experienced in any port of this game. The X68K version of Prince of Persia comes on 3 discs with the introduction and the main game in separate places. While first getting it to run, this made it the port most like operating a terminal at a nuclear power station, requiring a precise combination of discs to be inserted in the right slots in the right order. But once I got it going, I found a decent conversion. It's obvious to compare it to the PC98 port, from which it's a minor but perceptible downgrade, but taken on its own merits, it's still a competent copy of the game. Riverhill Soft's next stop on their Godzilla-like rampage through the Japanese computer entertainment market was the TurboGrafx X at the end of 1991, which I went through in the previous video. They followed it up by setting their sights on Fujitsu's FMTown's computer for a 4th port in 1992. Despite my usual verbosity, I don't really have a lot left to say about this port. Once again, it's obviously very heavily based on the PC98 version in both graphics and mechanics. It contains all the same levels, plus the extra Japanese final boss level, this time in the traditional numerical order and capped at 12, and it includes both the speed and replay options. Something unique to this version, though, is that the screen is a little taller than usual, allowing you to see a small amount of detail beyond just the floors in the screen above. It doesn't usually make a real difference, but it was thanks to this that I discovered this potion above the main path of level 11, which I seriously didn't know existed. In fact, all 3 of the ports I've mentioned differ slightly in how they use the display. If you look at a PC98 screen, you can see that they chose to overlay the health bar potions above the bottom row of the playfield, and left a gap at the top where nothing was drawn because the combined height of the screen's floors didn't quite work out to a round number. The X68K version found a use for that unused space, and combined it with its extra 20 pixels of vertical screen space to move the life potions out to their own status bar and shift the display of the game upwards. The FMTown shares the PC98 screen resolution, and goes back to overlaying the potions on the game, but then fills out the extra space at the top instead of leaving it blank. The other differences are very small. There's no music in the dungeons, apart from during special events and fights, although I do wonder if I was missing out on any CD music due to not playing a copy directly from the disc. I was sure when I started the game up that you needed to press up much earlier than on any other version to make the prince leap from the edge of a platform correctly, but either I was wrong or I just got used to it as the game went on. I'm pretty sure that the block button is a tiny bit less responsive in this port though, and oddly the ability to crouch and bunny hop forwards has been removed, meaning that your window for getting through closing doors is reduced. Riverhill Soft would follow this version up by publishing their last port of the game on the Sega CD at the end of 1992, then the Mega Drive and/or Genesis would get its own non-Riverhill Soft derived version a year later. After that, porting of the game went quiet for a couple of years before some interesting latecomers started arriving. The ZX Spectrum was a computer that was sadly skipped over during the original manic Prince porting frenzy. The developers of the Sam Coupe version approached their publisher Domark about reworking their port onto it as well, but by that point in 1992 it was already known that the Spectrum was about to be discontinued and they didn't see a viable market for it. They also had doubts about the machine's ability to run the game at all. It wasn't until 1996 that they would be proved wrong by a Russian coder whose name I can't pronounce, but who went by the online handle Nikodim of the cracker group Magicsoft. Despite its discontinuation, the Spectrum remained a popular computer in Russia until the late 90s, even coexisting with CD-ROM drives, so this version of the game became widely recognised there while being virtually unknown everywhere else. It was written and distributed around the former USSR without any agreement from the game's original creators or much in the way of anyone who cared at all about software piracy. Ironically, this unofficial copy was itself pirated by multiple other groups who added their own names to the game plus a few cheat codes in the same style as the Amiga version. From the beginning, impressions of this port are quite good. The title cards have been translated into Russian and the opening scene is still intact, though it's been simplified so that it wasn't necessary to animate Jafar walking in or out of the room. The very first screen once you start the game is straight from the NES port, with you being asked to walk left or right to choose Viesti Parol or Novaya Igra, but mercifully the resemblance to the Nintendo version ends there. Every character in the game is a monochrome white due to the limitations on how the Spectrum handles sprites, and you'll often see this computer's trademark discoloration of sprites as they pass in front of the background objects that define colours of their own. Something you'll notice quite early on is the eerie silence of the dungeons, which made me wonder whether my sound was working at first. You'll only get the occasional blip and fanfare during sword fighting, and the lack of sound cues makes it difficult to know when a gate is opening or closing in particular. The Prince's movement is just about right, but not absolutely perfect, and has some tugginess to it where a couple of actions like turning around take longer than they feel they should. Platform edge detection is technically present, but I definitely wouldn't rely on it as much as I do the PC version. The controls at least work semi-consistently, and even though when I started this video series I didn't think that I would be setting the bar quite that low, this already puts it in the top tier of conversions. Another challenge is that the controls are mapped to the keyboard keys QAOP, where the left hand is used for up and down movement, the right is used for left and right, and you're free to use your preferred thumb on the spacebar. This was common on the Spectrum, which lacked arrow keys on its awful rubber keyboard, but it's surprising how much this arrangement can throw you off and make you press space when you really wanted to jump. In a different way from other versions, where I've talked about the controls being too unforgiving, these are actually sometimes the opposite and are a bit too eager to compensate. For example, sometimes you want to start the Prince running and immediately hold up in preparation to jump, but the Spectrum controls give you a wider window than normal where it'll interpret holding left and then up as a standing jump instead. The other way round, there are also times when you want to come to a stop and then perform a standing jump immediately, but the game tries to let you off letting go of the left or right button and assumes you meant a running jump. In both circumstances, you'll probably land on some spikes. One other thing that will kill you a lot is that the Prince has a very long lead time for pulling out his sword. You really have to stop a good distance away from an approaching adversary to give him time to fumble it out of his trousers, and if a guard hits you before you're prepared, it will result in instant death. As far as fighting the guards go once you get that far, things are mostly okay, although I found limited use for the block button here and preferred to step in and flail around to hit guards and whittle down their health points. Unfortunately, the guard's reaction to obstacles hasn't been fully implemented, taking away some satisfying moments. Guards and biting gates are unable to coexist in the same part of the space-time continuum, and the guard will simply disappear and ignore the chopper if pushed near it. This is one of the few ports to make significant changes to how the original levels are laid out, mostly due to being the only one to have only 8 tiles horizontally on the screen instead of the usual 10. Even the Game Boy managed to squeeze all 10 of them in. Having just 8 tiles per screen means that all the rooms have to be readjusted slightly to fit the new width, and if you've played the DOS version more than is frankly healthy, you'll find yourself thrown off by the differences. Usually the changes have been made pretty well, although I did notice this colossal oversight of the shortened gap on level 9 that allows you to open the exit far earlier than intended, therefore rendering the level substantially improved. I also encountered some other strangeness in the second set of dungeon levels. My playthrough was going very well until I encountered this tile that should open a gate in the room to the right, but no matter what I did, it remained glued in place. Strangely, the solution is to ignore this room entirely and just drop down much earlier, where a falling tile sticks a gate open and allows you once again to skip the majority of the level. Less usefully, I find myself totally unable to open this door on level 8, but a look at a playthrough video on YouTube seemed to have no problem with it. I was only able to continue by switching to the double pirated version of the game released by the group Another World, which fixed the stuck floor plate. Elsewhere, the game occasionally completely abandons the DOS layout and just goes off on its own, resulting in a bit of a surprise for me as I fell down a pit which previously didn't exist. A couple of game elements didn't survive the journey to the Spectrum. The palace doesn't have its arch tiles, making it look a bit plain and unfinished, and noticeably there are no gate-closing tiles anywhere in the entire game, meaning that some of the clever obstacles that involve them don't have the effect that they used to. Falling platforms do exist, but will never hurt you if they fall on you, and it's also not possible to die in the biting gates if you're taking careful steps, no matter how appalling your timing is. As a final point, spikes are always revealed instead of shooting out of the ground, which is really only an aesthetic difference, as they would normally activate whenever the player is above them anyway, and it saves on some animation frames. The biggest change is towards the end of the game, where levels 10 and 11 have been swapped around. Level 11 has a severely reduced number of falling tiles along its top row, making it much easier to get the health upgrade potion, and the removal of floor plates that close the gates means that the level's main puzzle is completely neutered. Therefore, I wonder if Nicodim chose to swap them because the 11th level was now much easier than the 10th. Alternatively, someone might just have dropped the level data printouts and picked them up in the wrong order. Prince of Persia for the Spectrum, then, isn't perfect, and it has to take some liberties with the original game. But it is at least pretty competent, and for someone to have patched a hole in Prince's world domination by porting the game so long after its initial release shows that it had a strong following. However, the Spectrum's main rival wouldn't get its own version until more than a decade later, even leaving room for a new official version of the game to be released. In the year 2007, after breathing new life into the Prince of Persia franchise with the Sands of Time trilogy, its new owners Ubisoft got hold of Gameloft to create a remake of the game that started it all. With it being a ground-up remake rather than any attempt at a straight port, this is the version most far removed from any other iteration of the game. As you would reasonably expect, it represents the largest graphical overhaul since the Super Nintendo version. The levels have been translated into 3D environments with some nice but not overwhelming scenery that gives the rooms a bit more variation. Where the Spectrum cut the number of visible tiles down to 8, this bumps it up to 12, but the rooms are still really only 10 tiles wide. It just lets you see a bit further ahead into the rooms on either side before you get there. Especially once you're out of the dungeons, the graphics also give the levels more context and sets them in a beautifully crafted backdrop of statues, balconies and water features. The cutscenes have been given the same kind of upgrade, with the game's backstory being retold with a 3D version of Jafar coming to the princess's tower and summoning an hourglass that ticks for some reason. The prince has been remodelled with his more plausible Middle Eastern appearance familiar from the Sands of Time games, and there's also much more variation in the guards that populate the dungeon and palace. When you take your first steps into the dungeon, the thing that will really hit you in the face is the series of infuriating prompts and help banners offering such advice as pressing forward and jump to jump forwards. In addition, if you hesitate for even a moment, then you'll start seeing a friendly blue butterfly that will encourage you gently but firmly towards your destination. Now, the audience for games in the HD era is much wider than it was in the early 90s, and we have moved on from the time when it was acceptable to 100% of players to have a game just say, "Here's a dungeon, now get on with it." My attitude towards this is that if someone's picking up a controller for the first time, I can definitely believe that they would welcome some guidance. Please let me turn it off. And thankfully you can do exactly that in the menus. If you go a few levels deep, turning off hints will both get rid of the banners and the butterfly, though for some reason it took a couple of goes for me before my preference stuck. The movement in the game is completely different from any other variant and takes a lot of getting used to if you've played the old ones. The weight of the controls has been completely removed and is replaced with a much more immediately responsive configuration closer to what you'd expect from a standard platformer. The platform edge detection has been taken out entirely, and so has the need to anticipate your jump. Instead, the prince will jump immediately when you tap the button, no matter where on the platform he is. After playing so many other versions, this approach makes me incredibly nervous, and I found it very difficult to unlearn what I'd known before, so I found myself pressing jump too early a lot of the time and dying unnecessarily. The rules for jump distance are still intact. A standing jump will take you 2 tiles and a running jump will allow 3, but the length of run-up you need before the game counts it as a running jump has been significantly reduced. The prince's repertoire of moves has been increased a little from the original game, allowing some things to be done more quickly where they previously had to be carefully set up. The backflip is used like a normal standing jump that ends with you facing in the other direction, and is good for places where you've climbed up a gap and immediately need to be on the other side of it. The amount of time you spend having to turn carefully around and line yourself up with a platform overhead is also avoided by the ability to run and bounce off the wall on your way up, transforming the entire sequence into something a lot faster. And if you run a bit further towards an edge than you'd intended, you have the ability to save yourself by turning to cling on if you desperately flick the control stick back at the platform on your way down. At first I thought these additions were unnecessary changes, but after playing with them for a while and getting used to having to use the analog stick, I had to admit that they made traversing the levels a smoother and, dare I say it, more satisfying experience. All of which is rapidly undone by the combat. When I talked about the Super Nintendo version of the game, I idly wondered what it would be like if the fighting were to be made a little more advanced and interesting than just alternating between block and strike. Like some sort of twisted genie with a grudge, Prince of Persia Classic grants this wish, and I absolutely hate it. At first, things seem alright. After picking up the sword, you make your way back towards the right of level 1, you encounter the enemy who's just earned his provisional guarding license, and can safely slash him 3 times, then finish him off, as this prince studied fighting from playing Mortal Kombat. But as early on as level 2, you'll start having more trouble as the guards fight back much more aggressively than they used to. My experience really reached its low point on level 5, where the 3 guards in quick succession during the run to the levels left caused me no end of trouble. It's hard to articulate just how frustrating it is unless you've experienced it for yourself. Your own attacks come out painfully slowly, and enemies seem to be able to lunge at you much faster than the prince's reactions allow for. When you parry a blow, you get an unnecessary bullet time style effect that quickly becomes infuriating, giving you a window to get a strike that may or may not just be overridden by a follow-up attack from the enemy. The guards have multiple different types of attack, and they seem to all have to be blocked with different timings, with certain ones having an unbelievably tight window. I was hesitant to bring this up as too strong a negative because I was terrified that I might just be rubbish at fighting, but I skimmed some Google results for it, and it seems that many people had the same problems that I did. I think I was starting to get the hang of it later on, as combat did seem a little less insufferable by the end, but it's still a huge sticking point in an otherwise pleasant version of the game. I tried various approaches, including being more aggressive and leading with my own attacks instead of waiting to be able to counter-attack the enemy, but after 20 minutes of repeated failures to get past the 5th level, what I ended up doing instead was choosing to bravely run away. You can do this by holding forwards towards the guard and blocking them a few times until they do the particular move that will cause you to change sides when parried, then taking a step back and sheathing your sword as they swipe the air just in front of you. It takes some timing to get right, but it really makes the game a much better experience when you can mostly skip the worst part of it. The frustration of combat is balanced out a little by the addition of at least one checkpoint in each level. Again, people might want to talk about dumbing the game down here, but personally I'm absolutely fine with them, as I need to get this footage captured before my toddler wakes up and I have to sit for another hour with her slapping Valentine's stickers all over my head. The game's timer works a little differently as a result. When the prince dies, taking the option to restart from your latest checkpoint will sacrifice the time you spent on the failed attempt, but choosing to restart the level will reset your time to when you entered it, as if you had restored a saved game. Though it was released 2 decades after development of the original game was started, this remake mostly avoids making other changes and sticks closely to the levels of the original. The 2 exceptions are in the climactic fights in the middle and end of the game. On the 6th level, I charged into the room expecting to meet the usual comically rotund guard, but let out a tremendous yelp as I was instead confronted by a bus on legs armed with a club. Shockingly, I was barely able to beat him the first time and was free to go on my way. A much harder new fight awaits you at the end, as interestingly this version brings back the final Jafar fight in the tower that first appeared in the Japanese lineage. It even adds some elements to it. At first, Jafar briefly fights you in the normal place, but calls on another bashing specialist when it looks like he's losing, but they made the fight at the top of the tower unique by arming Jafar with a laser staff and a force push to make it more difficult to get up to him. This would normally make it an exciting and special final boss, but sadly if there's one thing I didn't want this game to do, it was to give me more combat. Nevertheless, with several tries and a bit of luck, I was able to knock him cold, rescue the princess and live happily ever after. Some replayability is introduced with an inscrutable points system that judges you on how well you performed during a level, and once you've completed the game there are a couple of extras you can have a look at as well. There's time attack mode, which says that you're meant to complete it as fast as possible, so I'm unsure how it differs from the main game, and also a survival mode. This mode gives you 1 hour to complete the game, grants you 1 life, and can get stuffed so hard it's not even funny. I'm pretty sure I'd be able to do this on the DOS version, but the thought of having to hope the combat would hold together for the whole unbroken run puts me off what would otherwise have been an interesting update to the game. Alongside Prince of Persia Classic, there was also a different port released on iOS called Prince of Persia Retro in 2010 that used the Macintosh graphics. But because we live in the age of virtually inexhaustible internet storage and archival ability, it has since been arbitrarily taken down from the store and erased from existence entirely. The classic version, however, remains available on the PlayStation Network, the Xbox Live Arcade and the various mobile app stores. Technically, this makes it 4 or 5 versions, but they're all the same game. I should only warn that the controls for the game on mobile are reputedly a bit rubbish. While this port may look a little primitive compared to the one we've just seen, the process of bringing Prince of Persia to the Commodore 64 was a very long one. In the early 90s, when the game was busily being ported to everything that had a screen and some semblance of an input device, Commodore's flagship home computer was another machine that was noticeably overlooked. It's true that much like the Spectrum, it was beginning to age at this point, but it wouldn't be discontinued until 1994, and it was 5 years newer than the Apple II, where the game had originally started. In 1993, a pair of developers from Hungary called Attila Pohoraj and Viktor Varga made a start on an unofficial conversion. They reportedly got quite far with a workable demo of the prince running and jumping through a dungeon environment, but then somebody lost the tape and all that's been seen of this port is a slideshow of rendered rooms. A couple of years later, another attempt was made by a separate group of developers also from Hungary, setting up a prototype of the game on the Commodore Plus 4, which was the cheaper business-oriented variant of the Commodore which came with a suite of office tools. The basics of the display and the player movement were present in that version, but the game didn't progress much further than that. It wasn't until 2009 that more work would be done on this port, when Andreas Varga, also known by his online name Mr. Sid after the Commodore 64's sound chip, chose to refresh his programming skills by writing a conversion of the game to the computer's catchily named 6502 assembly language. He started by picking apart the original code for the Apple II version, guided by Jordan Mechner's own notes on how the game was put together and organised in memory, and by working on and off for a couple of years, he was finally able to give the Commodore 64 its own version of Prince of Persia in 2011. And this port is absolutely incredible. The game isn't a one-to-one conversion because of Andreas having to work around the slightly different severe limitations across the two different 8-bit machines, but the important parts are recreated perfectly. Just like on the Apple II, the Prince's animation and movement is far more satisfying and responsive than you would expect from such an old machine, and the nuances of the controls, like the rules around running in and out of spikes, have all been correctly ported over so you won't run into any nasty surprises by suddenly dying where you wouldn't have on the PC. I'm convinced that the sword fighting runs a little faster than it does on DOS, although it's perfectly possible that I just have that impression because I expect it to run more slowly here. However, the guards are undoubtedly more aggressive and combat is much more of a challenge. After a smooth start, I find myself dying a lot on level 8, but I never thought that this was through a fault of my own. It was really due to a combination of my own carelessness and playing very early in the morning. As far as flaws go, there really aren't many. The only place you'll really notice a drawback compared to the PC is when the game slows down a bit if multiple objects are moving on the screen at the same time, but I think that even this amount of slowdown is less noticeable than it was on the original Apple II version. It also shares the Apple II's feature of having a couple of slightly irritating pauses when drinking potions or winning fights, justified in the game's development blog by saying the machine just doesn't have the memory to both play music and allow for player input at the same time. I went through the game trying out my usual tricks, and the big ones like sailing through the diagonal join in the wall on level 7 are faithfully recreated. Interestingly, the bug that allows you to teleport upwards on level 12 is there, but the other bug that cancelled it out is not. Once you've left the game's grid, you'll be in an unstable state where you'll fall through the platforms, so speedrunners will be slightly disappointed here. Finally, the upside-down potions on level 9 just do nothing, which is a shame, but it isn't something that many players are going to care about. The other really impressive thing about this version is that it's written in a way that allows you to plug external levels into it. Prince of Persia still has an active modding community, regularly churning out new levels and graphics that you can use by overwriting the DOS version's data files, and the Prince of Persia Commodore 64 Total Pack, available at popuw.com, comes with a large library of them and a front end to help set them up. This launcher is able to take the data from level files and overlay them onto the standard cartridge image file, producing a new cartridge that you can load up in an emulator or even flash to real hardware. And it's greatly to the port's credit that it's even able to handle level sets like the repetition of time, which are for advanced Prince players, and use very specific tricks of the engine that weren't necessarily intended by Jordan Mechner originally. If you want to know even more about this port's history and development, Andreas Varga wrote up the process of taking apart the original game's code and recreating it in a 10-part series on a dedicated blog, which I'll link to in the description. It contains a lot of assembly code that's frankly beyond me, but whether you understand that or not, the decisions he made and how he crammed the game into the Commodore 64 make a really interesting read. The BBC Micro by Acorn Computers was released in 1981 and was used throughout British schools during the time of my life that I was in them. My own secondary school only switched to teaching on PCs in about 1999. I learned to program on the BBC computers in a language called Commodore, where I spent most of my time being impressed that I could make double-height coloured text that flashed a bit, so to see something as sophisticated as a fan-made port of Prince of Persia running on it is hugely impressive. The port was started in 2017 by Kieran Connell of the BBC Micro enthusiast group Bit Shifters, and it was released the next year. By this time, Jordan Mechner had found the original Prince of Persia source code lying around on an old disk in his attic, and he had generously put it up on GitHub for anyone to play about with. Therefore, this version had the luxury of being able to be ported directly from the original source without having to pull a decompiled version apart first. The goal was initially to get the game running on the popular BBC Micro Model B, but it quickly became clear that it would be necessary to have 128 KB of memory to match the original game, and so the port ended up being for the BBC Master, which was an upgraded version of the Micro that was released in 1986. The background graphics were all created specially for this version, and for a computer that's more than 3 decades old and that can display a grand total of 7 colours, they really are spectacular. The limited colour palette is dithered together to make a set of tiles that look like they have real depth and shading to them. The foreground characters are less heavy on the detail, but are still recognisable. They're all coloured an alarming shade of purple, but this coincidentally avoids the slightly uncomfortable fact that the allegedly Persian prince on DOS looks more like an English insurance intern called Ronald. As you would hope, but not exactly expect by now if you'd had to play the number of dodgy ports that I have, the controls of the game are absolutely spot on. The prince is extremely responsive in both movement and combat, he detects the edges of platforms perfectly, and all the subtleties of controlling him seem to be in there. In a deliberate and targeted attempt to thwart and confuse me, the controls for this version are split the other way around from how they were on the Spectrum. Now your left hand deals with horizontal movement on Z and X, and the right hand handles jumping and crouching with the quote and slash keys. Thankfully, an option to redefine the keyboard is provided, so I didn't have to just give up and map a joystick to it. The only peculiarities that I noticed were that you can't press block and strike too close together because they'll cancel each other out, and a mildly annoying but by no means tragic pause between screens while the next room is drawn. A tiny yet important innovation in this version is the addition of a dedicated forward jump key. Several of the Japanese or console versions added this, but they weren't totally consistent about its use. Here, instead of holding your breath and hitting 2 arrow keys at the same time, you have a second button that you can use either to perform a forward jump from a standstill or trigger a jump while running. The up arrow also works, but I find myself relegating that to just climbing straight upwards. This small addition makes leaping around the dungeons much more comfortable, though unfortunately the same key doesn't work as a backup button for clinging onto platforms like it does in the more generous Super Nintendo port. If this version has one noticeable drawback, it's the speed that you've no doubt noticed by now. The game is tuned to run very quickly. In fact, it's almost in the territory of the Super Nintendo version of Prince of Persia 2, but the rest of the game around it is solid enough that it doesn't feel anywhere near as out of control as that version. However, it does slow down quite a lot on screens where things other than the prince are moving. This inconsistency sometimes makes it difficult to judge the rhythm of biting gates and can catch you off guard when rooms change over. But having said that, it still passes the general litmus test that I've been using for deciding whether a version is any good or not, in that I never actively felt like I needed to use save states to avoid hurling my entire desktop out of the window. Following that rule, the BBC Master version is yet another very successful fan port that beats most of the official ones. And so here we are back on the PC. This isn't the original DOS version, it's an open source translation of the game to the STL library called STLPop, which was started by another David who runs the Prince of Persia original trilogy forums at popot.org. It runs natively on both Windows and Linux and was based on disassembly of the code from the Prince executable, therefore it's the DOS version out of the box. But it also allows people to extend the game in ways they couldn't before, and I'm going to have to talk about this one in a video of its own. In its added options screen, it has a set of toggles for fixing individual oddities in the game's physics, or some graphics options, like this mode I'm playing with here, that darkens the game except around torches. It also comes with better support for swapping modifications in and out for playing fan-made variations on the game. This one's called Prince of Persia, and it relies on the player knowing a ton of strange unintentional workarounds to even get off the first screen. And with that, my journey through the various editions of Prince of Persia is once again at an end. There weren't any absolutely hopeless conversions this time around, and I don't really want to give the impression that this last ranking screen is at all important, but here's my rough attempt at stacking them against each other. I had hoped to also show you some even more obscure computers, like the unofficial version on the Soviet ATM Turbo, which was completed in 1994, but I eventually had to conclude that there's a limit to how much of my life I can reasonably spend trying to get a game working on machines that nobody's ever heard of with all the instructions in Russian. Besides the completed ones, there are a ton of impressive projects that enterprising people have started to attempt to implement the game on other platforms, such as the GP32, forcing it into the PSP via DOSBox, and even tapping out assembly code on the Texas Instruments range of graphing calculators. For now then, until people complete another batch of Prince of Persia conversions on the PDP-8 or the Babbage Analytical Engine or their thermostat or something, I think I've now played the original Prince of Persia on almost everything on which it exists or existed in all branches of space and time. I'd like to thank Jalal Nuraldin of the Prince of Persia unofficial website at popuw.com for making the research for this video much easier than it was for the last one, as the site has a great collection of the various ports, both official and unofficial, finished and unfinished. It's a great starting point if you want to look at playing some of these versions for yourself, as well as looking further into the history of the game. And so I'll finish once again with a race between all 9 conversions that I've mentioned. If you haven't had enough of me yet, you'll also get some recommendations for watching a couple more of my videos where I go through the back catalogues of publishers like Apogee and Epic in a continued attempt to talk about every DOS game in the whole world. Kindly prepare your eardrums for a bit of a pummeling, and I'm looking forward to talking to you in the comments about your own favourite versions of the game.